And the other point where he's in a rock and a hard place is on the healthcare debate. Obama, of course, wants a public option. It looks like the people in the Democrats in Congress, especially Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid, people further on the left, want a public option in the plan, and the public option polls absolutely miserably when put in the context that the public option will reduce the amount of people on private health insurance through their employers. That once the public option is made available, employers will drop their employer coverage, and everyone's going to have to go into the public option, and there'll be far more people on it than we ever thought before, and there'll be far less people able to acquire private insurance through their employer or of course personally than before. And that is absolutely something that people just don't want to see. Every poll pans that out. But at the same time, if they pass any sort of healthcare reform legislation that doesn't include a public option, then that's going to irate Obama's base because they've been looking forward to healthcare reform going way back to the 30s with FDR. Truman tried it, he failed as well, and so of course did Hillary and Bill Clinton when they first took office in 1993. So the Democrats have had many bites at the apple here. This is the largest majority they've had in almost a century, having the presidency and both houses of Congress. And it looks like, once again, it's not going to pass. And any healthcare reform bill that doesn't have a public option will probably be seen as a failure from any political observers, even people who are conservative that don't want the public option and are relieved it's not part of the legislation. I think they're still going to see this as a major, major loss for Obama. And perhaps, ironically, the worst thing that could happen is if the public option does pass, because if it does, then it looks like the Republicans may very well take the House, which they were really not projected to do even before this week's election victories that they had. It looked like the Republicans were going to gain anywhere for, I think, Clive Crook of the Financial Times, who's always been a guru and sort of a seer on election trends. He said as many as 4 to 6 seats, and he recently has gone up to 16 and even 21 House seats that the Republicans will take back, and that's even before we find out what ultimately happens with healthcare legislation. Either way, Obama's going to have serious problems if the public option passes and puts a lot of Democrat House seats in jeopardy. And if the public option doesn't pass, it's just going to look like a complete legislative failure, and he's banking a lot of his political capital on it. And then going into 2010, about midway through 2010, in June, on or before June 3rd, as the saying goes in Britain, the British Parliament will experience a huge conservative landslide against the Labour Party. They're all behind their leader, David Cameron, who gave an absolutely stellar speech in Manchester earlier this month that laid out the conservative agenda for the British parliamentary elections in early June. And the Conservatives are absolutely going to, every projection is that the Conservatives are going to win dozens and dozens of seats, and David Cameron will be the next Prime Minister of Britain. And what's interesting is that's going to be the beginning of the 2010 campaign season for America between the Republicans and Democrats, where every House seat is up for election. And I think that Republicans will do very well to take David Cameron's speech in Manchester and just play Mad Libs with it. A lot of the things that David Cameron said, he basically ties the central crux of the speech is he ties the debt and the government debt into how it affects the middle class and even the poor, and how it increases inflation, it increases prices, it demands very high levels of taxation for generations. And he says that we as a country are obliged to pay this debt, or else inflation and tax rates going on generation after generation will just be out of control. And I think that if the Republicans have that, anti-Obamacare, anti-cap and trade, anti-big government message that they've always had, and tie it into how it really connects to the middle class at the kitchen table when they're paying their bills, when they're paying their taxes in April of every year, I think the Republicans will have a winning message. They'll have the wind at their back, and I think they are going to take the House regardless of what happens with the health care legislation, which will be the biggest focal point of the 2010 elections, whether it passes or not. And where I think Obama's tipping point was about a month before the elections in November of '09. And what happened to Obama, one thing was in his control and the other was completely out of it. And he looked like a fool for both. And I think that polished the most luster off of him. Uh, and that was when Obama went to Copenhagen to pitch to the IOC that his hometown of Chicago should get the Olympics. That was a miserable failure. It was a public failure. It's one of those things where, people don't really know who Van Jones is. People don't know that, Geithner didn't pay his taxes. People don't really follow those nitty gritty things that most of us do. But everyone knew Obama went to the IOC to pitch Chicago to get the Olympics in 2016. And for Chicago to get eliminated in the first round, I think that showed a lot of people, wait a minute, not only are we not believing this guy the more he talks, but people internationally, who he's always been very popular with, polling in the 70 and 80 percentile of approval. Now, those people aren't, really doing what needs to get done whenever Obama speaks with them, because giving the Olympics is, of course, a big deal, but it's something that Obama should have been able to push through. Probably somebody whispered in his ear that, hey, this is a guaranteed thing. He was desperately in need of a victory with the healthcare debate stalling at the beginning of October, end of September. So he flew over there and figured he'd get a notch on his belt. Instead, Chicago was eliminated in the first round, and he did not look much the wiser for it. And then later that week, about 7 days later, because it was the end of one week, the beginning of the next, we found out that President Obama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And most people can't tell you who won the Nobel Peace Prize year to year, but it's major news. Everybody hears about it. And to see somebody like Obama win it, I think people were a little skeptical of that because it's too early in his tenure. He really hasn't done anything, especially given the problems he's had with healthcare reform. It didn't seem like he was really focused on international affairs, so people were wondering, where does this come from? And a few people maybe have delved further into it, and they found out that in February was the cutoff date for nomination. So Obama was in office for less than a month when the Nobel Prize Committee decided to award him the Peace Prize. And those two things, and ironically, he's probably going to accept the Nobel Peace Prize when he's making the decision whether or not to ramp up troops in Afghanistan. And he's probably going to increase the troop levels there. And he's going to receive the Nobel Peace Prize within the same maybe 2 week time period. So there'll be a lot of news articles talking about the irony of that. So when we ask about Obama's tipping point, in my opinion, the real tipping point for Obama was an impromptu trip to Copenhagen. Thanks for listening.